Well, welcome everybody. 2025, opening up the new year with our topic of Hagoita. Hagoita are a type of Japanese New Year's decoration. They are used to celebrate the coming of spring. They're also sometimes used for Girls' Day and other felicitous occasions. As a general rule, it's welcoming the new year, but they're also used to welcome young girls into the world, okay? So it's often used for girl-related topics. So you'll see them outside of New Year's, okay? We're going to be talking about the New Year's decoration called Hagoita. Hagoita are a paddle type thing. It's a little bit like playing badminton. And so what you have are a couple of paddles. It requires at least two people. And the birdie that you might use in badminton is made from soap, beans, and feathers. So it's a pretty hard item and actually can leave little pits and dents in the paddles as you use them. Now, these types of paddles are available at Japanese craft stores throughout Japan. Kids buy them for grammar school and so forth. In this case, they put the handprint, they're writing the date and the different felicitations. Kids might draw their own pictures. They might draw this year's snake, since it's year of the snake and so forth. I pulled a couple of videos from YouTube on Japanese YouTube to show you how it's played. Whoever misses, whoever lets the birdie drop, winds up having sumi painted on their head. That's the traditional way of playing the game. So you can see she missed the birdie, got a little bit of painted on her. Now it's his turn to get it painted. A lot about your personality comes out in this procedure. You can see these two are being fairly kind to each other. This couple is playing out in the front of their house, and they've opted not to do the sumi on the face. So in a contemporary setting, most people don't do this, but in the old days, everyone did. That was just part of New Year's. And here you see a couple of young guys being a little bit more rambunctious in how they're applying it. He's trying to apply more than he should have, so his friend objected. As they go back and forth, eventually their faces will get covered with sumi. There are different rules that apply depending on the region. These folks are playing in Tokyo, and so he has a circle around one eye, which is the first miss. The second miss is one line. The third line, which would create an X, is the end. Okay, so he's lost the game. Some regions allow you to basically cover the whole face, but you do it with smaller strokes. The rule is always one stroke per miss. So you saw earlier they did a spiral, but it was still one stroke. Here's a young woman playing in traditional dress. It's a block print from the old days. And you'll notice here, let me stop for just a second. In my circle, what you'll see is this bit of fabric hanging out over the edge. What that tells us is she's using not the type that we just saw, which is a flat paddle, but what you can also see here, there's some fabric, perhaps you can see under the yellow paddle, and you can see quite a bit of something sticking out on the other side of this paddle. Well, those are actually very large padded decorations. It's a type of artwork called oshi-e, which we'll discuss more in a moment. And about 400 years ago, they started up these huge markets of these padded New Year's Hagoita decorations. Now, in the old days, they really were just the plain paddles, sometimes elaborately painted, sometimes bejeweled with things and so forth, but not these big, heavy padded ones. That was basically a marketing technique. But once it caught on, it really caught on. And these are the results that you see today. Okay, so notice the faces in the different one. This is a very contemporary one. This is one from the 1920s, and I think you can easily discern the difference between the two. And here again, we have Betty Boop and Mickey Mouse. And then on these wooden paddles with these padded cloth designs, on the reverse side, there's normally a painted imagery, in this case of Mickey Mouse. In a contemporary setting, you have all of these images from a decoration store. Kyugetsu is a famous doll store in Japan, so these come from Kyugetsu. This is what was his name? Recent prime minister. And then, of course, you recognize the baseball star. And we also have the gold medalist coming up. So basically, the theme can be whatever image person you idolize. They can be pop stars, they can be politicians, obviously. They can be folk heroes, whatever you choose to do. Anything's open for it. So here we have three ladies playing hanetsuki is what the game is played. The paddle is Hagoita. The game is hanetsuki. And you can see the elaborate detail that goes into these padded images. Well, as I said, this started about 400 years ago, but the technique, this oshi-e technique, didn't begin then. It was around long before that. It was used to create these wonderful padded Girls' Day dolls. It was used to create padded images on tops of boxes, on satchels. Here's another box that's entirely covered in cloth with this exact same technique of design. And here's a little girl's satchel. So this one's very flexible. It's not hard. The padded ones have a hard backing. These other items used on textiles tend to have a softer backing to them. This is a very elaborate version of one, just to give you an idea of what's possible. There's a combination of the padding and the hand painting, and often this arching of the padded design to give it greater depth. Even the crest on the back of that is a piece of paper, cardboard, covered in the fabric to give it depth and relief. Now notice in this case, to help create the illusion of relief, a little sort of a cork-like piece has been put in the back of it to help raise the entire surface and allow to the sense of grand 3D impression. This particular item, though, is called a noshi. Perhaps you've seen a Japanese gift, something you bought at a department store that's wrapped in paper. Usually up in the corner will be one of these little sort of diamond-like shaped pieces called a noshi. That's just indicating it's a gift. It's like putting a bow on a package. And that's what this is. This happens to be a very, very elaborate version of one. So I hope in the images you're seeing on your screen, you can appreciate the relief involved. Most of the items you'll be seeing today are from my own collection. For those of you who took the charms class a while back, we covered how to make these in that course. And then I'll also be having a class similar to this coming up for Anwig in Seattle this year. Not all of them were decorative surfaces like boxes and bags. Some of them were just like paintings, decorative framed pieces for the wall, as we would have an oil painting or something. But all of them have the same textile padded relief format in common. Notice, though, unlike quilting or applique or something that we might do in the West, you see the little pieces here creating the collar, but the face itself has been painted to add a lot more interest to the piece. And quite often, the fabrics themselves are specifically painted for the item. So in this case, this kimono that the child is wearing wasn't necessarily a scrap that was pulled from the scrap bag and used to create this piece. It could very, very easily be something that the artist painted specifically for this child once all of the padding was applied and the fabric stretched over it. That way you could make sure that the imagery crossed the seams at the appropriate place and had the proper flow imagery that might relate to the overall aesthetic of the piece. Okay. I do like the delicate faces of these kids. So they're very beautifully painted, very sweet looking children. And this is a round wooden frame that contains this piece of a warrior. Okay. The background has been painted, and the pine tree at the top, as well as the two figures, have all been done with this padded technique. Notice that this section of the eye is actually padded and then painted. There's a much more elaborate version. This is what we normally think of as a Hagoita for New Year's Day. This older warrior or a beautiful damsel are depicted. Quite often imagery from kabuki theater, characters from kabuki theater are used. Originally, when this market started 400 years ago, that was what was primarily shown, were the famous kabuki actors of the day. Today it's politicians maybe, but at that time they were famous actors. And this gives you, again, the idea of the detail, the exquisite painting. The rulers there just to give you a sense of size with it. All of the elaborate handmade hair decorations. Let's look at how this is made. This is a craftsman, and what he has here is a small stencil. He's using that to apply, not to apply the features, those are going to be hand painted, but to put sort of a guide, very, very pale guide as to exactly where the eyes go, where the mouth goes. So that's not something he determines each time. And in this particular instance, let me back up just a little bit here. What he's doing is he's applying a layer of powdered seashell that's been mixed with gelatin over the surface of the silk that has been stretched over the batting and attached to the cardboard and back. So that gives it a very high quality porcelain. They're not really porcelain, but what people call Japanese porcelain dolls. It gives it that very porcelain-like luster because it is actually seashell. Okay, so that's applied very carefully. Then the proper brushes are selected, and layer after layer, it's delicately built up. The dyes he's using for the painting are exactly the same dyes that we use in the katazome process or bingata. They're natural pigment dyes. And here you see the face as the painting develops in sort of fast motion. Now, rather than jumping right in with the complex Japanese techniques, I mean, traditional techniques that are quite involved, let's start with a children's project. So here we see a little bunny rabbit, silhouette of a rabbit. It's going to be cut out of what amounts to very heavy tagboard or chipboard. This gets laid out on top of a very thin layer of sponge for the children's project. And then you can see they're cutting out with what amounts to a seam allowance. The rabbit is going to be glued to that sponge. Okay, and you can see the sponge here, the foam rubber, cut out precisely to shape. Okay, it's going to go back on the larger piece. And I misspoke earlier. The larger piece actually is cloth. And this cloth, in this case, has a sticky backing to it, so they're not using any glue. And each of those little tabs that have been snipped get bent around to create the soft edges. And as each little element is created independently and then stacked, you wind up with these cute little bunny rabbits. They represent the rabbits on the moon who are pounding mochi rice sweet cakes. So let's go back to the more complex traditional methods here. Okay, these are all the different, we'll look at several different varieties of faces. Normally, of course, these are commercial artists. They're producing many at one time. So usually they'll work on 5 or 6 faces at the same time, 5 or 6 bodies at the same time, rather than set up and take down for each individual Haguita. This gives you an idea of the detail of the faces. Now, of course, like you do with quilting or anything else, you're going to start with a cartoon and go ahead and paint in roughly the colors that you planned. The other thing that you're going to need to do is notice how the cartoon is drawn with the underlapping pieces complete. So it's not as if this seam stops at the hand. The garment is going to go under the hand, and so the pattern piece needs to be drawn out puzzle-like to go under the hand. The same applies to the fan and so forth. And like with the rabbit, the different pieces are going to be prepared. Once the initial piece of cloth is attached to one end, they start to add batting. The traditional pieces, the good quality pieces, don't use a foam rubber. They use a cotton batting traditionally, and nowadays more and more a polyfill type batting. The tool that was being used, let me back up here just a moment. This is called a kote. There are electric kotes called denki kote, and they're ones that you would shove into a hibachi with little coals to heat it, like they did the old days with irons. And so the heat of this iron is not only pressing the flaps into place, but it's drying the paste underneath at the same time so that the craftsperson can move along. So you can see they keep that heated. I was trained using the old kind you shoved in the coal, so believe me, electric one is much easier to use. And here that same paste is being used to prepare the hair. The hair is synthetic silk rather. Okay. And just step by step, everything needs to be built up. You can imagine how incredibly patient you have to be and careful with the supplies not to smear glue in the wrong place. This may look easy, but it takes quite a bit of skill to get the hair just right, as well as painting the faces, of course. Now, in this case, what he's done is he flipped the cartoon over to the back, so he can see some of the lines through the back because he's attaching the pieces from the reverse side. So as he moves along and positions everything on the cartoon, lines them up, he's going to take a piece of paper with paste applied to it and basically, like putting a Band-Aid across, attach those two pieces so they won't shift. Now he's going back to that powdered seashell again, in this case mixed with gelatin. Okay, nikawa is what it's called. And he's using this to paint in the images as I described for the children earlier. So this gohun shell foundation on the cloth gives a nice gesso for all of the colors that are to follow. So everything is painted in white first, and then the blues, the greens, and all the details are applied to the top of that. It is a plastery, chalky kind of medium, and so it does obliterate the texture at that particular point, like a gesso would. So you lose a little bit of the fabric texture, but you get the beautiful color and the glisten as if it were a metallic weave. Once all of that's done, he's going to need to attach that to the paddle itself. Let me stop for a minute. In the back here, what you can see is that there's another piece of silk that's been attached to the board and padded, and that has all of the hand-painted imagery in the back. So this is padded, but just with one layer, and then all of the flowers or whatever else the artist chooses to illustrate the back with, those are painted. He's using brass brads here, and you perhaps saw a moment ago where the awl was pushed in to create a hole, because this is quite a bit of weight that's going to be on the board, and simple glue won't hold it. So he's actually nailing the majority of the finished piece in place. Once he's almost done, he's going to want that relief, that bow out that we saw on the noshi earlier. And so at this point, he's going to go and shove in a lot of padding or a little crutch or something to bow out the surface of the body and give it more depth. And this also often pulls the head away from the back and gives a sense of relief. All of these are different versions. You can see in this piece all of this beautiful crane design. All of this was painted after the blue cloth was padded and assembled. It doesn't have to be people. I've shown you famous politicians and things so far, but it certainly doesn't have to. It can be any imagery the artist chooses to depict. Here we see the beautiful birds with the morning glories in the background. The shapes of the leaves, the petals of the flowers have been cut out, but then each has been individually painted to add color to the piece. And here you see the details of the bird. So I'll stop again for a moment. The bird outline is the head and the entire body. So all of the black, the orange, the yellow, the feathers have been painted, but then the wing is a separate piece sitting on top of all of that. What we've seen so far has been pretty high relief, to the point of shoving things in the back and making it bow up, to having very heavily padded garments and so forth. A lot of pop to it. But that's pretty much Tokyo taste. When you get into Kyoto area taste, there's a tendency to prefer a little bit more flat design. And that's what we're looking at here. This isn't a Hagoita, it's a framed piece. But you can see there's not nearly as much relief in this quiet person than there were with the warriors and such. So we'll take a little bit closer look at her face here. So it almost is hard to tell that it's this padded, layered look at all. It almost looks quilted in this case. And that's the general taste of the folks in the central region there. We saw that warrior's head with all of its padding. When we flipped it over, we saw how all of these little pieces of paper hold all of the jigsaw puzzle pieces together from the back and leave the front clean. That's the back of the head, obviously. Go ahead and look at the front again for a second, just for review. Following through on this concept, let's now talk about a process called oshi-e. Okay, oshi-e, oh, excuse me, kiribame. Oshi-e is the process we just looked at, which is this covered board, padded, piled up. That's oshi-e. Osu, the verb osu means to push. So they're pushed, piled pictures. Okay, the next one we're going to look at is kiribame, which is the technique that eventually led to oshi-e and is still quite popular. So kiribame is more like inlay. Think of parquet floors and so forth. So what we're going to look at is the same technique without that padding and without the layering that we saw. This is a piece of a Chinese woman, a Japanese concept of a Chinese woman. And if we look at the back of it now, what we're seeing are all these different pieces, but we no longer have the need for the pieces of paper, the band-aids, the crutches, the bridges to hold them together, because everything is drawn out with the same kind of cartoon, cut out like a jigsaw piece puzzle, and all of those jigsaw puzzle pieces are fitted back together just like a jigsaw puzzle would be, and stitched where the pieces meet. So they're stitched and flat felled, and that's what you're seeing here is the flat fell, the opened up and pressed portion of that. Now there is often padding in this as well, but the key difference is you're not gluing and layering, you're stitching and matching. And that's what kiribame is. Kirihameru means to inlay, insert. And so unlike Western quilting, where often piece quilting, where all of the pieces are assembled all the way to the edge, quite often the Japanese imagery will be a whole cloth piece with sections cut out and our image inserted so that the cuts don't go all the way to the edge. And here you can see with this deer that the head is one piece. You can see the outline where it's been stitched, but the eyes, the face, the ears, all of that has been painted. Now, adjacent to it, the Chinese woman's garment is all out of this fabric called kindan, which is the silk fabric woven with gold. And it wasn't necessary to paint that because it's woven. And adjacent to that, her collar is painted. So it's a matter of combining all of these different techniques to create the most dynamic image the artist is capable of imagining. Here, the pine tree you can see has been stitched around the cluster of needles, but the branches themselves have been painted on this chirimen background. Chirimen's easier to use because as a crepe, it's forgiving. Now, this is one of my favorite pieces. Partly for its contemporary look. It's of an older area of Kyoto. But look at the detail on it as we get in close. This is kiribame, okay, or sort of a combination of the two, really. The lantern at the top, the ropes that are creating the look of the lantern have been appliqued to the top. But all of these other little pieces, every little bit in there, has been stitched together like a piece quilt. So here again, the yarn you can see is sitting on top. The bottom of the lantern has been painted, and each little section of the roof, Each little section of the siding has been pieced together, stitched by hand. This picture isn't terribly large. It might be as much as 15, 16 inches side to side. So you can see all of the railing, all of the tiles, the rafter pieces, all of that have been pieced in very meticulously, even to the point of the little potted plant sitting down on the stoop. Each leaf has been pieced and quilted. And I think here you can see by the weave structure itself how very small each piece is. And so what skill that would take. With my stubby arthritic fingers, I wouldn't be able to do that anymore. And then we're nearing the end now. This is my all-time favorite piece of all of them. This is an oshi-e piece, not a kiribame. And it's of one of the ancient gods of Japan. I don't know for sure. It might be Amaterasu, which is the sun god, but it may be one of the others as well. There's not really any iconography in her presentation to tell me, other than the magatama, which are these jade beads, tell us that she's one of the ancient gods. Okay. She has a bell in her hand. I'm sure some of you have seen these, the clay bells. Okay. This could very easily be metal as well. She has a spear in her hand. And she just has a lot of dynamic energy to her. What I particularly like about this is it's not pretending to be one of the glamour girls that we've seen so far, okay, one of the dancers. This to me looks more like an approachable person. She looks real and she looks determined, okay? I don't know if you're familiar with the movie Fried Green Tomatoes, but in that, oh, I can't remember her name now, all of a sudden, the actress who's so good in that, but she refers to Tawanda. She calls herself Tawanda, the Amazon spirit, okay, the Amazon warrior. And so this particular person reminds me a little bit of Tawanda in that sense. She's out to conquer the world, and good for her. Okay, and as I say, she's oshi-e, so every single piece you see has been cut out, padded, and reassembled together on top of a background. The tree and foliage in the background was all painted. And so it's a combination of all the techniques that we've talked about. So thank you very much for joining me today. I'm going to go ahead and sign off as far as our YouTube presentation and take your questions now. So if you want to come back on, we'll keep recording and go from there.